Hi, I'm Debbie Corpus, and before I tell you anything about our topic today, I have to tell you a little bit about myself. And that comes from this book, this very dilapidated book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. I found in my grandfather's chicken coop, and it turned me into a ludic reader. And in case you're wondering what a ludic reader is, I'll give you an example. A ludic reader is someone who finds herself crying so hard over Black Beauty that she can't see the words on the page. Or somebody who laughs so hard at Richard Lederer's books, The Anguished English and Get Thee to a Punnery, that she cries. Or someone that just reads for sheer fun and gets lost in the book. Or the kid who reads in the back of the classroom and misses the bus home. That's a ludic reader. That's someone who gets lost in a book. And my professional goal in life is to turn everybody into a ludic reader, someone who loves reading and getting lost in books. And the best way I know how to do that is to model it by doing read-alouds. And I think parents and teachers both can become experts at doing read-alouds that hook kids and make them want to become ludic readers. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do read-alouds with kids. But before I tell you how, let's talk a little bit about why. What's the power in a read-aloud? One of the first things, obviously, is that by doing read-alouds with kids, you can introduce them to new books, to new genres, to new authors. They just find out all about what's out there without having to walk into a bookstore or a library and feeling lost. You've introduced them. You've blessed the book. A second thing that comes about is that they can hear a fluent reader. They can hear the phrasing, they can hear how the emotion is supposed to go, they can hear the dialogue, they can hear the voices, so that when they read silently themselves, they can have those voices in their minds. They can hear it, and they can hear the fluency and know how it's supposed to sound. A third thing is simply seeing an adult who's reading and saying, oh my gosh, I want to be like that teacher, I want to be like that parent. And as a teacher and as a parent, I know part of what I'm doing is modeling not only my enjoyment for the books, but I'm also modeling how to think aloud, how to think about books, and so I'm thinking aloud for the children, how to respond to books, and that it's okay to laugh and to cry as I'm reading. It's okay to have the expressions come over my face that I'm feeling. So I'm modeling all those things for children as I'm reading aloud. A fourth thing, I guess, that I'm doing is I'm providing background information depending on the books that I choose. So I know in my classes I oftentimes read books from the 1930s because I didn't live in that time period, my students didn't live in that time period, but as we read about the people from that time period, we read about Joe Louis, we read about Marian Anderson, we can start understanding what that time period was like because we can live that time period through those characters. So as a teacher, I can set up background information for what I'm going to be teaching later on. And another thing I can do is I can help kids hear vocabulary and context through these read-alouds. Words are so much easier to decode if we already know what they're supposed to be. And we can get those words through hearing an adult read the books and talk about the words and what they mean, or just even using the context within the books. So those are all good reasons for reading aloud and a way to help kids become ludic readers by doing that. But I'd like to share something else too, and that is some of the work by Malcolm Gladwell in his book, The Tipping Point. He talks about how we can start an epidemic, how we can get a fad going. Well, I want a literacy epidemic. I want to get that fad going. So taking a look at his work, we know there are three things that have to be there. One, he talks about the law of the few. It doesn't take many people to start a literacy epidemic or any kind of a fad. It takes people who are mavens, who are connectors, who are salespeople, and we'll talk about that in a second. He talks about the message, how the message has to be sticky, it has to be personal and practical, and we'll talk about how to get books that are personal and practical. And then he talks about the context and how important the context of the situation is. So what we want to do is use those ideas and say, well, how can we apply them to read-alouds so that we can start a literacy epidemic? We can have a tipping point. So let's start off with the people involved. As a teacher, as a mom, I know that I really do play all three roles. I play the maven, the person who knows a lot and is so excited by what I know, I just have to share it. It's not like I want to just teach it. It's just, I'm just brimming over and have to share it. That's what a maven does. A connector is somebody who says, oh, you're interested in sports? Well, I know about some books in sports. Let me show you this biography of Gertrude Ederle. Did you know about the first woman who ever swam the English Channel? I can do things like that as a connector. And then the third thing is to be a salesperson. I think nobody has ever accused me of being blah. I'm very much rah-rah, very excited about what I'm doing, and I want that enthusiasm to come across to the students that I teach and to my own children. So embodied in a teacher, embodied in a parent, we have a maven, we have a connector, we have a salesperson. So that's the first thing that Malcolm Gladwell is telling us we need. The second, he says, is we have to have a message that's sticky. So that message needs to be personal and it needs to be practical. Our book choice. What are we sharing with kids in terms of read alouds? We can pick books that are personal to kids, that match their interests, that extend their interests, that build on what they already know and launch them into new areas. So we can make it personal in that way. We could also make it practical. We can show them the how-to books and help them see how those can lead us into anything from folding paper airplanes that fly the farthest to how to actually do some kind of a project. So we can share those books, and I've got obviously bookshelf full behind me that I can draw from. So again, the book is so very important there. And then the third thing is the context. And if you think about it at home as a parent, my favorite times for reading to kids were at bedtime. We had a normal routine. Every bedtime we always read together. So it was a time that was predictable and the kids could look forward to it. And secondly, I had books and bins by every easy chair, so that whenever I got tired, I could just grab a child, put them on my lap, and read one of the books to them. And so there was incidental times through the day, but it was something they could look forward to, and they could pick out books that they wanted to read for me to read to them. But in a classroom, what does this mean? That context of the situation. It means, one, thinking about what are the routines that I have in place. When's the best time to read? Holding kids back from going to recess is probably not the best time. But when they come in from recess, or a break between one subject and another so that they know it's coming, they can anticipate it, look forward to it. And then by doing that, know what the routine is for getting ready. Do they have a routine for gathering? If as a classroom teacher you have all the children gather together, do they know what those routines are so they can get to their spot on the rug without poking and pushing and doing all those kinds of things? You may have to practice that routine but many times and remind kids so they know how to go about doing it. I always read to older children as well, and I always try to get the routine so they clear their desks, clear the area in front of them. We are so used to multitasking that it's really hard for students not to think that they're supposed to be doing something at the same time as they're listening. I think that habit comes from watching TV where they're doing something at the same time they're watching TV. Well, I don't want that habit because you can't get lost in a book if you're busy doing something else as well. So one of the routines is just going to be that gathering routine. But a second part of the routine is the time, knowing that every day we're going to read together so that there's going to be that time. Okay, so we've got those things in place. And now, real practical question, how do we go about choosing good books? Well, as a maven, where do I get my ideas for good books? I have to admit, I'm one of the bookstore junkies. I do spend a lot of time browsing bookstores. But I also know bookstore owners, Shirley Mullins at Kids Inc. I walk in there and she can tell me books that are the latest things out there. And if she's ever giving a presentation at a conference, I go to find out what the new books are. I also have my professional journals. So whether it be language arts or whether it be something from the International Reading Association, when they talk about new books, I look at those to see what the new ones are that I might be interested in finding out about. I use that Amazon.com. If you like this, you might also like this feature, so I use that. I talk to my friends, find out what they've been reading and get the information from them. I also listen to my students. I find out some amazing books that I just kind of missed because I wasn't in the right circuits. I wasn't the best connector. And so my students connect as connectors and help me find out what books are out there. So I find a book that I think is going to be a possibility, but then something I have to do. I have to practice. I can't read it cold. I really do have to take a look and say, how do I go about reading this book? One of my favorites to read aloud is this book about Joe Louis, America's Fighter. And the first time I read it, I have to admit, I knew nothing about Joe Louis. So I had to find out about Joe Louis and do a little background reading so that I could bring something to this text. But then as I look through this, I have to think not only how can I read this with expression and where am I going to put the stopping points, I'm going to have to think, if I've got children in front of me, what are some things I want to do as part of this lesson? So a little tip, I put my lesson plan for my read aloud right in my book on a little Post-it so I can know what it is that I've done before and make notes to myself as to what was successful and what wasn't. So I see here that sometimes I do an anticipation riddle, a prediction riddle that gives them clues about Joe Louis. I do a timeline so they can see where Joe Louis fits in here. And then we do a circle frame graphic organizer where I just have them look at the cover and I say, well, if you don't know who Joe Louis is, what can you tell from the cover? And they tell me, well, he's a boxer and he's a black man and it says he's America's fighter, so he must be a hero of some kind. And then I know he's a man, so he must have a history. And that sets us up as we do the reading. So I go through and I figure out when do I want to show the picture, when do I not? So for example, it starts off, it says, Joseph Louis Barrow, the grandson of slaves, was born on May 13th, 1914, into what he called a no-place-to-go world. I don't show him the picture yet. I say, if it's Alabama and it's 1914, why might this boy think it's a no-place-to-go world? And they have to use their background knowledge. What do they know about the South in 1914? And what might the family have done? And almost always kids will say, well, they raised cotton or they farmed or they sharecropped, if they know that word. And then I show them the picture. I don't show it to them first. So part of what I do is I go through and plan the book. I decide, when do I show the picture, when don't I? And so that's all part of my planning piece as we go through. Another thing I do is I also figure out what I'm going to do to keep the kids engaged. So for example, when I do the Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins, you'll see all these little yellow tabs here. Well, I know here I'm going to show another picture that go along with this. I've got a little note here to myself to do that. At this part in the book, I have a note that says, reporter interview, Queen scientist child bricklayer on holiday. That's all part of the planning piece as I think about how I'm going to go about doing a read aloud. And if it becomes what I call a mentor text, a text I just come back to over and over again, I keep those plans and those notes in the book so that I can use it again with another group of students. One other thing to think about in terms of your planning is if you're doing a chapter book of some kind, and you can't obviously do it in one sitting, how are you going to help kids get back into the book the next time you sit down? How are they going to remember? And there are different strategies you can use. The simplest, of course, is simply rereading the last paragraph or so of the chapter you did the last time. So that'll help move them in. But I'd also suggest keeping some kind of a visual organizer so that they have a symbol of some kind that the kids have agreed on for each chapter. And then they can do what's called a repeated retelling. So on the second day, they remember what they'd read the first day and they listen to come up with a symbol. Then on the next day, they tell the story based on those two symbols and then come up with a symbol for the third after hearing the chapter. So anything that will help, because even though the books like this is Knights of the Kitchen Table by John Cheska, kids will love and they will beg you to keep going because every chapter ends with a cliffhanger. Don't do it. Don't let them talk you into it because you want to build that anticipation. And then the next time you can say, all right, remember? The Black Knight thundered toward us. His lance pointed directly at us. We were about to be killed more than 1,000 years before we were even born. And then they're going to say, what happened? And then you can move into the next chapter. So having some routines in place to help kids with the books, and that's all part of that planning that you're going to do as a teacher and as a parent. So how do you know if you've launched a literacy epidemic in your own home or in your classroom? First thing is, you'll find that your own children and the children in the classroom will want to reread what it is that you've read aloud. The most popular books will be the ones that you've read, and they'll want to keep reading them over and over again. That's great. Second thing you'll know is that you'll hear kids talking about the book. They'll talk about the book at the recess. They'll talk about books over there when they have a chance for conversations. But more importantly, when you're teaching something, suddenly they'll make a connection. Oh, that's like Joe Louis. Oh, that's like Marian Anderson. And when they start making those connections, you start going, yes, I've got them, because they've lived part of that book. A third thing is that they'll want to find books by the same author. So the John Cheska, if they liked The True Story of the Three Little Pigs written by A. Wolfe, they'll like Knights of the Kitchen Table. So maybe the same author, or books in the same series. If they like Knights of the Kitchen Table, they might like Tut Tut, or My Mother's a Neanderthal, any of the ones in this Time Warp Trio series. They might also find, if you like this historical fiction, you might like this historical fiction. So you can start using what's known to get them to broaden the books that they're interested in reading. Another surefire way of knowing that you've been successful is if kids complain because you've either shortened the amount of time for the read aloud or you've had to skip it one day. And if they're complaining, then you know that they really wanted that time. And then I always know I've captured them. When I have students come in and say, oh, this is my favorite book. Would you read it aloud to the class for me? And so when you've got kids offering you books and sharing books that they've loved reading and want you to share it with the class, you know you've started an epidemic in your classroom. So as a parent, read alouds allow us to bond with our children. My children are in their 20s now, and we still quote lines of children's books to one another in certain situations. And we talk about books, and we laugh about having lived through Ron and Hermione's and Harry's adventures so many times together. We bonded as a family over that. But as a classroom teacher, I know I also bond with my students in the classroom over the read alouds. They just mean so much to us, and they are a touch point that we can come back to over and over again. So I hope you are a ludic reader yourself and that you're ready to start an epidemic. Thanks.